Chapter 6, Economic Transformations, Commerce, and Consequence. All right, before we begin, let's go ahead and do a refresher over the Columbian Exchange.
Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. So in Unit 4 of AP World History, we've been talking about the expansion of sea-based empires. And in this video, we're going to talk about the momentous change that occurred when the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere came crashing together. And that change has a name. It is the Columbian Exchange. And if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get to it. First off, if you're new here, my name is Steve Heimler. I'm here to help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And if that's something you're into, then subscribe and come along with me. And I know I'm not the only one who's making AP World History videos out there, but I'm doing it the most balded, the most bearded, and the most gap-toothed. All right, enough of that. Let's talk about the Columbian Exchange. And I don't think I'm overstating it to say that the Columbian Exchange changed the world on a scale that few other events had. In the short run, the Columbian Exchange meant disaster for the natives of the Americas, but on the other hand, it meant extraordinary wealth and profitability for the Europeans. But in the long run, for all involved, the Columbian Exchange introduced new ways of life and new ways of death through the mutual sharing of the East and the West. So first of all, what is the Columbian Exchange? Well, its name comes from our good buddy Christopher Columbus, whose landing on the island of Hispaniola launched this whole exchange. But if you want a definition, it's essentially this. The Columbian Exchange is the transfer of people, animals, plants, and diseases from the East to the West and from the West to the East. So let's start with an upper. Diseases. Until Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, Afro-Eurasia and the American continents were completely isolated. And through a series of unfortunate or fortunate events, depending on how you look at it, these two worlds came crashing together. Because of this long-term separation of these two people groups, the Native Americans had no immunities to some of the more devastating European diseases. And the most devastating of the bunch was smallpox. Smallpox was an airborne disease that Europeans had been exposed to for many centuries, and even though it was still devastating, they had built up some immunity to it. But when the white people showed up in the Americas and started coughing all over the natives, the smallpox contagion was deadly to a people who had never encountered it before. It was this disease that was responsible for the large-scale death that occurred in the Americas. In general, historians estimate that it wiped out about 50% of the native population, and in some places, upwards of 80 to 90% of the native populations were destroyed. But that's not all. The more Europeans arrived in the New World, the more diseases they brought with them. They brought malaria and measles and the flu, and all of these wrought disaster on the native peoples. And in terms of its scope, you could compare it to the devastating effects of the Black Death in the former period. All right, if you're sufficiently depressed after that, let's move on to some happier matters, namely animals and food. The sharing of animals and food in the Columbian Exchange actually went both ways, from east to west and from west to east. And in many cases, these food and animals, when they were introduced into these societies, had massive effects. For example, the Europeans introduced pigs and cows and wheat and grapes into the Americas. And these food items eventually became staples of the American diet. I mean, what would we be today without beef? I mean, I know that 50% of your population is dead from smallpox, but on the upside, cheeseburgers. The Europeans also introduced horses to the Western Hemisphere, and the adoption of that animal changed the lives of the Native Americans who lived in the plains regions. After they learned to ride horses, they were able to hunt buffalo with greater efficiency, and that meant, in many cases, excess food. Also, the horse gave tribes a competitive advantage against other tribes who did not have horses, so not only could they kill buffalo better, they could kill other human beings better too. But there's also some food that traveled from the west to the east. The Mesoamericans introduced some very important food items to the Europeans. For example, you had cacao, also maize, which is a kind of corn, and potatoes, which is a kind of potato. And when these were introduced to Europeans, it led to an expanded diet and, more importantly, massive population growth. All right, now let's look at the Columbian Exchange in terms of agriculture and labor. Now, even though the first European explorers were in search of gold and silver for the most part, they found that if they devoted these colonies, these new lands that they found, to agriculture, they could get fabulously rich. But there were far too few European colonists to attempt that kind of large-scale agriculture, so what to do? First solution, enslave the natives and make them do it. And this kind of worked, but there was a major problem. Turns out these natives knew their own land way better than the colonists did, and so they would often escape their enslaved conditions off into the hills, into the forests, where they would never be found again. For example, the Portuguese dealt with this in their Brazilian colony. They started growing sugarcane there, and it made them so wealthy that when the natives ran off, they just went and cried in a bag of money. But it wasn't long before they got tired of crying into their money bags, and they came up with a different solution. And that solution was to import enslaved labor laborers from Africa, and in Portugal's case, especially from the Congo Kingdom. This solved the problem of the natives so rudely escaping because the Africans knew the land less than the colonists did. And as the demand for sugarcane and in other regions tobacco spiked, so did the demand for enslaved laborers from Africa. And that meant that millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and made to participate in what was called the transatlantic slave trade. But in a strange turn of events, even though the African population was being largely deprived of its menfolk, the African population in general rose significantly during this period. And the reason is, again, because of the Columbian Exchange. While enslaved people were being transferred from the east to the west, foods like yams and manioc were being transferred from places like Brazil into Africa. And those new foods created a massive population spike. And finally, we need to talk about the environmental impact of the Columbian Exchange. It shouldn't surprise you to hear that the natives of the American continents have been farming for many, many centuries. And they had developed ways to live with the land sustainably. But when the European colonists arrived and grew wealthy through agriculture, they started using the land much more aggressively. And that led to large-scale deforestation and the depletion of the soil. And because the Europeans tended to live in more densely populated settlements, they put a greater strain on the water supply and introduced a lot of pollution to boot. All right, that's what you need to know about the Columbian Exchange. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. If you want me to keep making these videos, then subscribe.
Okay, so that is the beginning, the Columbian Exchange. So let's
Come along.
Let's go ahead and look at Europeans and Asian commerce. Okay, everybody wanted spices. We know this. Europe had monarchs that were more efficient, and the population was rebounding from the plague. So remember, the plague killed off a whole bunch of people, changed the labor sources, got rid of serfdom and feudalism, serfdom in Japan and in Russia, and then more into feudalism in Europe. Muslims at the time are going to control the trade supply. Think about where that is. The trade supply with maritime trade supply, when you're talking about Indian Ocean trade, you've got your whole all your Muslim caliphates right in here. And then Africa is also Muslim and Christian. So you're going to have that. So let's look at this here. So what do we see in this image? Well, what you see is it is a European negotiating with African slaver, demonstrating that the Africans played mediating roles in the acquisition of slaves in Africa. So the slavers in Africa, notice these are the people that are being purchased. This looks like the king of a tribe, and here is a European. And they are discussing the purchase of those slaves.
Hi, and welcome back to Heimlich's History. The last few videos we've been in Unit 4 for AP World History, and we've been considering how maritime empires were established from 1450 to 1750. In this video, we're going to look at the kind of influence these empires had in Africa and in Asia. And then we're going to look at the kind of European rivalries that spurred this imperial expansion on. And finally, we're going to look at the labor systems that kept this whole
This video is not working very well right now.
Expansion machine.
So go to Heimlich's History, Unit 4, Topic 4, Maritime Empires Established. And I'm going to go ahead and move forward from this because for some reason it is not working very well for me this morning.
Running.
So let's go ahead and look at this image. Oh. Let me go ahead and zoom out of this. We have Africa. Africa being, you have the king of spices over here. Africa is known for ivory, gold, many things. Okay. Here is our Spice Islands. This is where everybody is trying to get spices. That is why you have the Europeans trying to travel to get to India because they want to be able to get over here to the spices. Okay. The Spanish and the Dutch, remember the Dutch basically took over this, which is why the British weren't very happy with them. King of the Spices, the Spice Islands over here. Bartholomew Diaz, has his trade routes right here going all the way around Africa. Vasco da Gama also going around Africa. So these are definitely areas that we are used to seeing. So whoops, we're skipping past that one. Let's go ahead and go on to a Portuguese Empire of Commerce. So remember that Portugal is pretty much like the place. They don't have the goods and resources to trade, so actually they just took to piracy to gain goods. They were not a group of people who were out there trying to gain land. They didn't have the resources to do that or the way to maintain those areas. And so they just took to piracy so they could gain the goods. They set up trade they set up not trade but piracy in Malacca and then tried to step it up in China and Japan, where China and Japan completely smacked them down. The Portuguese had a very short-lived stronghold over the spice trade. Basically, their use of force and not economic practice is going to hurt them. But their use of force is going to help them control half of that spice trade. How could a historian use this image to explain European views toward Native workers on the Indian Ocean spice trades? So how would you say a historian could use this image? Well, let's see. They're all working hard. You have a European here in charge. Maybe somebody who looks like a foreman. So let's see here. The workers are smaller than the figures on the far left onto the far right. They're scantily clad. They are doing the labor, while the figure in the upper right has lighter skin, is well dressed, and appears to be inspecting what the smaller figures are harvesting. This tells us that Europeans viewed native workers as inferior and uncivilized, but also as necessary component of the spice trade. So that is what we get out of that image. Ooh. Back into Europeans and Asian commerce. Spain and the Philippines. So let's look at this. Let's look at our map here. So again, here's our spice trades over here to the right. Territory under Spanish control is in the green. Territory in Dutch is in the purple. And then we have a little bit of Portuguese that controlled the spice trade in Africa. Also, all of the little squares are European trading ports. So the Europeans definitely set up. This is going to start European imperialism. Again, that's going to be one of those things that leads right up to World War I. The Spanish are going to take over. The Spanish takeover of the Philippines was not very difficult. After Magellan, there were a lot of small alliances formed, gifts and favors to the chiefs. Pageantry of Catholicism is going to make it a lot easier. So why is the location of the Philippines so attractive? So let's check this out here. If this picture will not be so blurry. Okay, go back. And we froze. Awesome. Let's look at this one. Let's look at the Philippines here. So the Philippines, why would this be so important? Well, Srivijaya, that empire is right here. The Malaccan Strait is right here. And if you want to get to any of this over here, you're going to have to go through the Philippines at some point. Also, the Philippines is close to China and Japan, making it really just a perfect setup. So definitely someplace you'd want to go. So circumnavigating the globe is going to definitely be something that is going to be very appealing. So what are we going to have? We're going to have the East India Companies. These are joint stock companies and the beginning of British control in India. So what we're going to have is, here's an image. How do the Europeans view themselves in relationship with their Asian societies? So let's look at this. We have got some Greek Roman gods. Here's some people that look like they're beneath them, slaves beneath them, gods looking onward. The painting uses symbolism from European, Greek, and Roman past. The Europeans are portrayed as classical gods and goddesses, therefore they appear superior to all others. The native population appears to be supplicant and seems to be offering goods, probably spices, to the gods in return for treatment good treatment and peace. Thereby, the native population is viewed as subservient to the Europeans. We do know that this is how their attitude was. So let's look at what goes on in the East India Company.
Obviously, if you've read Indian history, you'd have heard about the British East India Company. The company had ruled India for almost about 200 years. It plundered India, looted its artifacts, traded slaves, and of course, laid the foundation of the British Raj in India. Now, the reason why we are talking about the British East India Company is because, in a very curious twist of fate, this British East India Company that had set up its empire in India is now being owned by an Indian. Here's a report.
This is the biggest colonial irony. Imagine owning something or someone who once owned you. Well, that's exactly what an Indian has done. He has bought the East India Company. You must be familiar with the company's name. In case you aren't, here's some history. The East India Company owned India and much of the Indian subcontinent. Not for 1 or 2, but a good 250 years. The company was founded in the year 1600 by a group of English merchants. They pooled in nearly £70,000 to start the company, which was originally meant to trade spices. In 1613, the company established its first factory in Surat. That's in present-day Gujarat. In 1757, the East India Company seized control of the Mughal state of Bengal.
Mughals.
How, you ask? Through force. The East India Company's charter authorized it to wage war. Back then, it had a 3,000-person strong army. It was led by Robert Clive, who went on to become the governor of Bengal.
We've looked at this image.
Soon the
And
East
this
India
image.
Company shooed the French and the Dutch from the Indian subcontinent. It went on to conquer a big chunk of the Mughal Empire, which includes present-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and half of Afghanistan. Now, if you think a Facebook or Apple or Google is powerful, consider this. The East India Company dominated much of the Indian subcontinent between 1611 and 1858. It literally owned this territory. At its height, the company had an army of 260,000. That's more than the present-day British Army.
Think about that. A business had an army. That is how powerful they were.
The company was responsible for almost 50% of world trade and enjoyed a near monopoly on the global tea business. The East India Company was the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen. It controlled everything from the opium trade to the slave trade. What happened then? In 1858, the British government ended the company's rule in India. By 1874, the company was dissolved. Cut to 2003. Indian businessman Sanjeev Mehra bought 21% shares of what remained of the company. He reportedly partnered with businessman Anand Mahindra and Gulf-based retail tycoon Musuf Ali Ma. In 2005, Mehta acquired shares of all the other stakeholders. The deal gave Mehta the right to the name, the East India Company's chop marks, and its coat of arms. Mehta also got the replication rights to all of the company's exhibits kept in museums worldwide, and the reprinting rights of all old documents, including navigation maps, records, and library materials. So what has this Indian businessman done with the East India Company? He has transformed it into a luxury tea, coffee, and food brand. The company has outlets in the United Kingdom and West Asia. But that's not the man's biggest achievement. He has made a statement by owning a company that once owned his people.
Very
He has
cool.
pulled off the most pinching colonial joke.
So the East India Company is going to be so powerful. It's going to have its own coat of arms. But most importantly, it is going to have an army that is going to control Britain. And we're going to see that that is going to end through the works of Gandhi. Very powerful, though. Very, very powerful. Okay, so Asians and Asian commerce. Art is going to become a huge thing. Europeans are going to arrive in Japan during a warring states period among daimyo nobles who had a cadre of samurai until the Tokugawa shogun unites Japan and closes its border. They are going to create the Tokugawa shogunate, which is going to be a military dictatorship, and that's going to be in Japan. This is a centralized government. Okay, so the Tokugawa shogunate is going to come in and they are going to set up a centralized government in Japan. And that is going to be new. Many women in Asia are going to play a large role in commerce. Daughters are going to be trained how to make a profit. So you're going to see women's roles in Asia really get better. Virjivora is going to be a businessman from the Mughal era. He is going to have a monopoly in pepper, and he is going to sell it to the Europeans at a much higher price because the Mughal Empire can. And he is going to be a mediator between the Mughal Empire and the East India Company, and that's going to be pretty important. So perspective is the Europeans are going to dislike him, as well as he was the only one that would lend them credit. And when he did, it was at 12 and 18%. Indians say he was an unsung hero and a philanthropist who charged 1.5 to 2% interest to them. He is going to be very important, and he is going to be somebody that India still looks up to today. He is going to be basically a hero because he's going to kind of like stick it to the Europeans, charging them a lot of interest for things that they want. And that's not something that the Europeans are going to like, but obviously in India they do.
And the whole country broke into pieces. Everyone is fighting with each other for local power, and it's anybody's game. Knock knock, it's Europe. No, they're not here to take over. They just want to sell some like clocks and guns and cheese. So that's cool, but everyone's still fighting each other for control. Now with guns. And wouldn't it be nice to control the capital, which right now is puppets with no one controlling them? This clan is ready to make a run for it, but first they have to trample this smaller clan, which is in the way. Surprise, the smaller clan wins, and the leader of that clan steals the idea of invading the capital and invades the capital, and it goes very well. He's about halfway through conquering Japan when someone who works for him kills him, and then someone else who works for him kills them, and that guy finishes conquering Japan. And then he confiscated everybody's swords and made some rules. And now I'm going to invade Korea and then hopefully China, he said, and failed, and also died. But before he died, he told these 5 guys to take care of his 5-year-old son until he's old enough to be the next ruler of Japan. And the 5 guys said, yeah, right, it's not going to be this kid, it's going to be one of us, because we're grown-ups. And it's probably going to be this guy, who happens to be way more rich and powerful than the others. A lot of people support him, but a lot of people support not supporting him. They have a fight, and he wins, and starts a new government, right here. And he still lets the emperor dress like an emperor, and have very nice things. But don't get confused, this is the new government, and they are very strict. So strict they close the country. No one can leave, and no one can come in, except for the Dutch, if they want to buy and sell. But they have to do it right.
Remember, the Dutch are going to be very important in Japanese trade.
Here. Now that the entire country was not at war with itself, the population increased a lot. Business increased, schools were built, roads were built, everyone learned to read, books were published, there was poetry, plays, sexy times, puppet shows, and Dutch studies. People started to study European science from books they bought from the Dutch. We're talking geography, skeletons, physics, chemistry, astronomy, and maybe even electricity. And the whole country broke into pieces.
Okay, so that lets us know what goes on with the Dutch in Japan. And I did not mean to do that. Okay.
Peace.
Okay, so that is going to end our Europeans, and Asian commerce.